Cool, it says I'm live. See if people will come. Just let people filter into the room. I think Andrew said he would come in person, but I never confirmed that I would be here in person, so I don't know if he'll actually come. Interesting setup here. Just gonna go here. Oh, need to provide Surya Zoom link. Hello.
I have streaming time.
Okay, so you guys appeared in the Zoom. Hello, Surya. Hi. All right, Andrew just entered the room and then immediately left, so I guess he's going to come back. Make sure my slide goes back and forth. I'm a bit concerned that my the stream has frozen. Let me see. Application capture Google Chrome. It's a little frustrating. Well, no, okay, now it would make sense to go forward. Okay, now, yes, my slides are changing. And they change whenever I move the arrows back and forth. Okay. Looks good.
Yeah, seems good.
All right. Shall we get started? Looks like we have some YouTube viewers as well. Welcome, everyone. Okay. So in this iteration of the reading group, I'm going to present this paper that Aura and I just put up on 51% attacks with using like a quantum computer, basically. So if anyone is worried that quantum computers are a complicated subject, don't worry too much. We won't really be going into the details of how quantum computers work. We're just going to be showing really like one sort of example of something that quantum computers can do and how that can be used to basically 51% attack Bitcoin with sort of in principle with any size of quantum miner would allow you to do this, as long as it's like a fault tolerant quantum computer or whatever. Okay, so yeah, a quick summary of the talk. So it's an attack on sort of Nakamoto consensus. I guess you could say it's an attack on consensus, pretty much as described in the Bitcoin white paper. So I think Or and I have thought a little bit about how this could potentially apply to basically any proof of work blockchain, no matter what sort of modifications have been made. So seems like there's some potential applicability there, but this talk is just going to focus on standard Nakamoto consensus. All that the attack requires in terms of quantum computational abilities is the ability to run what is called Grover's algorithm. So I'm going to describe Grover's algorithm is sort of it's actually pretty simple. I'm going to describe it in a single slide, which will be the next slide. And hopefully, basically, that one slide will be enough, one or two slides will be enough to basically entirely understand how Grover's algorithm works and what it can do. The way that the attack works is using the difficulty adjustment mechanism of Bitcoin. So basically, I think all proof of work blockchains have this thing they do, which is that to make sure that blocks come every 10 minutes or every 2 minutes or whatever the target is, as the hash power changes, they have this way of changing the difficulty of solving a single proof of work puzzle. And that's sort of a key feature of our attack. And the attack is basically able to do a double spend, or it's basically what the attack does is it produces another chain, a fork of the blockchain, which will have more total hash power or whatever. And it takes time, which is equal or approximately equal to the length of the difficulty adjustment epoch divided by r squared, where r is some measure of the hash power, basically. A little bit complicated, but I'll explain this more a bit later. Okay, so what is Grover's algorithm? So I've prepared this slide here to show you basically what happens when you mine a block classically and what happens when you mine using a quantum computer. So when you mine a block with a regular ASIC, every time you make a hash, that hash has exactly the same probability of being a solution to the proof of work puzzle as not, right? So the probability that you succeed, basically goes up linearly, and as you get closer and closer to probability 1 of having solved it, you sort of decays exponentially here. Every additional hash is equally likely to be a new block. But there's this special algorithm that you can run on a quantum computer if you have a fully fault-tolerant quantum computer or whatever. And that's called Grover's algorithm. And the difference is that, classical miner, you're sort of exponentially decaying upwards to 1, whereas with Grover miner, it's just this sinusoid. So this is literally just a cosine curve, or a 1 minus cosine curve that I've drawn here. And the key sort of difference is that instead of taking, 1 times 10 to the 23rd hashes to find a block, which is, I think, approximately what the difficulty is for Bitcoin as of now. With the Grover miner, it only takes 1 times 10 to the 11 hashes to be basically certain to find a block. And really the relationship is that if there's a search problem where you're trying to search for some solution and each solution has a 1 over n chance of being correct, then what Grover's algorithm does is it requires you to check, it requires square root of n sort of checking operations. So basically, if you can implement the operation, which is the operation of checking if a block hash is valid, if you can implement that in a quantum computer, then you would just have to run that circuit square root of n times to find a valid block. Instead of, the expected number of times with a classical computer would be n times. You would have to run it n times with a classical computer, but only square root n times with a quantum computer. And so this would obviously seem to confer a massive advantage on the quantum computer. The only issue is that, of course, quantum computers don't really exist. But I guess the other sort of caveat that there is, even if quantum computers were made to exist, the clock speed of the quantum computer might be much slower than the clock speed of a classical computer, right? And that might be like another disadvantage. But still, it's square root of n versus n, where n is approximately like 1 times 10 to the 23. That is in itself a big potential advantage. And so to zoom in on the first iterations, right? The other sort of disadvantage I would say for the Grover miner is that while this depicts the probability of finding a block after you do a certain number of iterations, the sort of problem that a quantum miner has is that they don't necessarily have enough time to do all that. Because in Bitcoin, a block comes about every 10 minutes, right? So if a block is coming every 10 minutes, it's the longer you sort of you could in theory, let's say you had a quantum miner which was capable of doing all this work in 40 minutes, right? Well, that's very nice, but it's not what you're going to be able to use to necessarily mine blocks on Bitcoin, because you will have mined that block in 40 minutes. And then you'll come back to the blockchain and see, 4 more blocks have already been published. The block that you made is not worth anything now, unless you can, as we will see, use it as part of some attack.
Can I ask questions on this? I mean,
yeah.
The first graph especially, I guess, didn't match my intuition. I would think of this as a linear process. I mean, I get that it's...
Yeah, so I guess that's this is zoomed in on the first few iterations. So I guess pay attention to the x-axis. The x-axis here is, if your probability goes to 1 as the time goes to infinity, right?
Yeah. So this is the probability of having found a block given that I've done this number of iterations. I mean, I normally think of just if I doubled my hash power, I would be finding winning blocks at double the rate.
Yeah. So I think that's basically exactly right. I would just say that if you zoom in on on this region of the graph, in fact, it is linear. And the other key observation is if you zoom in on this region of this graph, it's quadratic.
I mean, what's a reasonable amount of iterations that I could do in a 10-minute period? Because like you say, if it's...
Right. So we discussed this a bit in the paper. It's sort of tricky because there's lots of different estimates of how fast quantum computers would be, and if you use a topological quantum computer, it would be or something like that, it would be much better. There's these experimentalists who claim you could get a quantum computer that's basically as fast as a classical computer. Let me quickly actually look up.
I'm still just on this classical miner. This curve graph, I think, must only apply to one of the top mining pools that has already run for twice as many iterations as there are in a typical 10-minute period. If I've been mining, the top 3 mining pools have been mining for the last hour, then maybe they have a 90% chance of having found a block.
Right.
So I guess the point is just to say that for any reasonable amount of power, if you're not the largest mining pool, your whole area of concern will be in that linear range towards the beginning.
Yeah.
But then maybe that's also relevant to this analogous thing maybe this is also kind of what you're getting at with sequentiality. I can't just think of this as parallelizable. If I double my quantum computer size, do I get double that, or do I move up the curve or not?
That's a very important point. Grover's algorithm is not parallelizable in the sense that again, it's sort of complicated because there's a quadratic relationship, and so it's what exactly do you mean by parallelizable? But the point is that if you have n quantum computers that all run at a 1 hertz clock speed, that is not the same as having a single quantum computer that runs at n hertz clock speed. Because having a single quantum computer at n hertz clock speed is much better, because you can be running Grover's algorithm on that computer, and you'll be having an n squared speed up. Whereas n separate Grover's algorithm at 1 hertz clock speed, that would only be a square root n. Or sorry, it would only be an n factor speed up, whereas the single Grover would be an n squared, right? The single faster computer would have the full quadratic speed up.
Great.
So I guess it's the other thing that's sort of worth mentioning though is that if you have a bunch of Grover miners, it's still the case that as you sort of speed up, right? I mean, like each individual Grover miner still has individually the quadratic improvement factor, right? So if you're running a bunch of them in like a farm, right? If you build a Grover ASIC or whatever, and you mass produce your Grover ASICs and you make a Grover ASIC farm, then like the miner that would be doing that would have a curve that looks something like this, where it would be quadratic in the beginning. And so this is meant to be the zoomed in on the like first part of the graph where the number of iterations is now 0, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. And the probability of successfully mining is very small, and it linearly increases for the classical miner, whereas it quadratically increases for the Grover miner.
So if I can double the clock speed of my quantum computer, I'm quadrupling the
exactly.
performance of my mining.
Yes.
Cool.
Okay, so that is Grover mining. And the key takeaway from this slide and I guess the previous slide is that it's much better for the quantum computer if the difficulty is high and if the quantum computer can mine for a long time, because both of these factors sort of improve its sort of comparative advantage over the classical computer. So the thing that the quantum computer needs to do is increase the difficulty to get this advantage. Can a 51% attacking quantum computer increase the difficulty? The answer is yes, because Bitcoin lets basically in Bitcoin, you basically have unilateral control over the difficulty. Why do you have unilateral control over the difficulty? It has to do with the difficulty adjustment mechanism. So here's a quote from some early blockchain paper, don't know who wrote it. To compensate for increasing hardware speed and varying interest in running nodes over time, the proof of work difficulty is determined by a moving average that targets an average number of blocks an hour. And if they're generated too fast, the difficulty increases. So I guess what does this mean? So in practice, what Bitcoin does is basically every 2016 blocks, which is sort of, that's supposed to be like a 2-week time period. So every 2016 blocks, it times, in terms of the timestamps of those blocks, how long those blocks took to mine, and then it sort of uses that to sort of backwards determine what was the average hash rate over this time, and then it uses the average hash rate over the time to set the difficulty of the next 2016 blocks to whatever it is to sort of make the blocks come out every 10 minutes. And so what this basically means is that if I want to increase or decrease the difficulty by a factor of c, all that you have to do is space the timestamps of your blocks out at a rate of 10 minutes divided by c, right? So if I want the difficulty to double, I just need to make up the block timestamps and the blocks that I'm producing be like spaced 5 minutes apart. And that's basically all you need to do. Here, I want to make sure that there's no like questions from like the various chats.
Everyone's been quiet on the chat.
Yeah, okay, cool. So this is basically all you need to do. There's one small caveat, which is that in Bitcoin, there's this limit on how fast you can increase. Basically, you can only go up or down by a factor of 4 with each epoch, right? Each 2-week epoch. But that's actually not like too much of a problem for the attack that we're going to present, because what you can basically do is it'll take multiple epochs to just raise it again and again to the level that you want, but eventually you will be able to accomplish this. Maybe you could say it's like a practical problem because you'll sort of be taking multiple epochs and each epoch will take a long time. So it's like a question of like how many, like will it be months for your attack to work or will it be years for your attack to work maybe, but there's many sort of factors at play, but it's like the asymptotics are not ultimately affected. Okay, so
I have a question.
yeah.
So does the miner just choose any time stamp they want?
Yeah.
Make it blank.
So there's very little restriction on like what the times. So there are a few rules for the timestamps. I think there's one rule that says that your timestamp can't be.
Can you say the question again? Because I didn't hear.
Oh
that.
yeah, sure. So Nerla asked, can you really just like set the timestamp to whatever you want, basically? And the answer is basically yeah. I mean, it's even actually the case that you can set in some cases the timestamp to be in the past of a timestamp that you're building on. So I think there's two rules. One rule is that the timestamp can't be more than 90 minutes into the future compared to the thing that you're building on. So I guess that sort of like limits. It limits the factor. I mean, that on its own limits the factor that you can increase a block by a factor of like 90 of 9, right? Well, I guess this already that's sort of interesting. I mean, this is that would be on a per block level. So I guess there's on the per block level, there's sort of like a factor of 9 that is sort of your hard limit. Whereas on the per epoch level, it's a factor of 4. But in terms of blocks being in the past, I think all that needs to be the case is that your block timestamp has to be after the median timestamp of the previous 11 blocks. And so as long as your timestamp is always in the future compared to your previous block, that's always allowed. As long as it's always in the future and not more than 90 minutes into the future, I guess that would make sure that it's always allowed, at least with the Bitcoin rules as they exist now, as I understand them. So yeah, does that like cover? Yeah, okay.
Would they be able to adopt a mitigation to this? Maybe I'm jumping too far.
Would they be able to adopt a mitigation? Yeah, that's a good question. At the end, there will be like a slide with like 10 different ways of potentially mitigating this, and we can like discuss all that. Okay, so here's like a potential objection. Won't you have fewer? So if I'm going to increase the difficulty, right? And my quantum miner is not capable of mining blocks at the same rate as the entire honest network, won't you necessarily still have fewer blocks because the difficulty is like you're slower than the rest of the network, and then you're making the difficulty harder on yourself? Aren't you just making things worse for yourself as the quantum miner? And the answer is no, because Bitcoin doesn't actually use the longest chain fork rule, as is like sometimes the Bitcoin fork rule is described as longest chain, but that is not, in my mind, like a very accurate phrase, because what is actually the case is that Bitcoin decides which chain is best, not by the length of the chain, but by the total accumulated work that was done to create the chain. So it uses like something called chain work, which is basically the sum of the total number of expected hashes. And this is important. I think I'll have like a slide later which expresses why this is important in a classical setting, but it's very bad in the quantum setting, because what it means is that if we have a quantum miner that increases the difficulty factor by a factor of c, then they will be producing blocks square root c times slower, because right there's like a quadratic right, like when I quadruple the difficulty, because I'm a Grover miner and I'm using Grover's quadratic algorithm, I'm only going half as slow, but each block that I mine is going to be worth c times more. So the upshot is, if I increase the difficulty by a factor of c, my attack chain is going to be growing in chain work by square root c times faster than the honest chain is growing. And the point basically is that I can choose c to be some sufficiently large number, and then when I start mining, I will be producing work very, very fast, and that is going to make my chain better than the honest chain. It seems like I have a chat on the... okay, yeah, I've got a lol from the chat. Great.
Cool. So
that is what we have. Second potential objection is the suspiciousness of the timestamp issue, basically. So if you're making all the blocks, so here's basically the issue, right? I have increased the difficulty, and so I'm making blocks pretty slowly. And my timestamps, right, they're still, I mean, there's going to be some change in the spacing of the timestamps, but basically once I've ramped up to the difficulty I want, all of the timestamp spacings are going to be like held constant at 10 minutes for a while. And the question is, I'm making blocks very slowly, but the timestamp differences of all these blocks are 10 minutes. So the timestamp of my attack chain tip is going to be far behind the real time. And that's going to look very suspicious because like it'll be like 2024 and people will see like, whoa, like what is this block from 2023 that suddenly has more difficulty than the entire rest of the chain? So like a funny thing is that I don't think that there's anything in the Bitcoin code that actually checks for this. Like there's a lot of Bitcoin code, but so maybe I'm wrong about this, but I'm not sure that there's any actual, I'm not sure that this is an actual problem for the attack. But even if you could imagine like when this gets discovered, we'll just do a quick Bitcoin hard fork, which says that you can't respect blocks that are more than like a month old. But even if that fix was made, we can improve our attack to not have this problem. Basically, once we've built up such a massive lead in the cumulative chain work, what we can then do is we will have such a massive lead, we can then just take the difficulty way back down to a really, really easy difficulty where we can make blocks super, super fast, and we can recover all of the like timestamp difference that we've lost. And so the timestamp, like basically, you know, it'll be a process of going up and then like getting a whole bunch of difficulty under our belt and then going way down and then like very quickly building up the timestamp. Okay, so I believe the next slide is an animation, so pay attention because the animation is going to start and I'm going to try to like very quickly explain the animation as it's going on. It's going to be an animation of the attack. Okay, so here we have the honest chain and it's mining. And you can see the attacker chain over here, right? And it's slowly increasing the difficulty. And because it's slower than the honest chain to start with, the total difficulty on the attack chain is pretty small to start with. But because it's basically ramping up its difficulty, it's ramping up its ability to produce chain work, and it's basically growing to the point where it's getting much more difficulty than the honest chain. So as time goes on, it's being able to like really, really boost and basically double its chain work with every successive epoch. And basically it's going to reach a difficulty of about 256, and then it's just going to hang out there for a while. So now it's a difficulty of 256, and it's going to mine a few more epochs worth of blocks at this difficulty, just to like really establish a good lead in difficulty. And once it's established enough of a lead in difficulty, it's going to say, okay, now I'm going to ramp the difficulty back down, and that's going to allow my time to go forward. So you can see currently there's a big timestamp delta. Like this is the timestamp of the block that the attacker is mining, and this is the true time all the way over here. So it really needs to like move forward. Okay, but now it's ramping down the difficulty. So the difficulty is now 128, and it takes some time to ramp down the difficulty because, you know, the difficulty, right, like it's difficult at a high difficulty, and so it takes time to ramp down. But as it ramps down, it is able to ramp down faster and faster and sort of exponentially like increases its ability. And so now and already the difficulty is now like much, much less than 1, and it's really being able to quickly add the timestamp. And so you can see it's going to end up like right here where it has a high total chain work. And now the animation is reset, but it had a high total chain work, and it was at the correct time, the true wall clock time. And so that is basically that's basically the full, most developed version of the attack. Basically, so like what are the parameters here? I believe this is like an attacker that can produce blocks initially at like a quarter the speed of the rest of the Bitcoin network. And so this would be like a 25% attack, maybe you could call it, but yeah, so like you could choose different parameters, but this is just a visualization for this. And notice also that it only ever doubles or halves the difficulty. So it's well within the sort of 4 times difficulty factor change improvement that like is the limit for Bitcoin, and so it's totally fine on that front as well. But yeah, so we can sort of, watch the wonderful animation go again and again for a few times, and then I can move on. Any additional questions about how the attack works?
I thought that was super clear.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely had I was talking about this with someone like way back, I think during the IC3 conference back in last June or whatever. I was trying to explain this, and I think I was having trouble. It's sometimes hard to convince people that it's simultaneously possible to get a high difficulty and to have the timestamp be correct. But the point is that it's sort of convex, and you can do this. Okay. So another slide forward. Right. So the question is how long does it take, right? So obviously, if you have a quantum computer that runs at 1,000 years per cycle, that would not be a fast enough quantum computer to accomplish the attack in a reasonable amount of time. So how long does it actually concretely take to run the attack? And here it would be very nice to express how long it would take in terms of quote unquote hash power. But the problem is that because of this whole sort of quadratic thing, the concept of hash power is not very well defined. And so the way that we sort of say it in the paper is that we say, okay, let R be the number of honest blocks, or sorry, I think this might be 1 over R. Yeah, sorry, it should be 1 over R, but let 1 over R be the sort of the number of blocks that the adversary, okay, it's sort of, sorry, yeah. The number of blocks that honest nodes can mine in the time that it takes the adversary to mine a single block on its own at the default difficulty. And then the answer is that it takes big O of 1 over the square of that number. And so that's how many epoch times it takes to complete the attack. So if an epoch, right, is 2 weeks and R is 1 over 4, then it will take 32 weeks to complete the attack. And if you have, right, if you're able to only complete half the number of blocks in that time, then it would take more 128 weeks to complete the attack, which is more like 2 years. So it sort of gets worse and worse, but the sort of silver lining is that just because R is the number of blocks that an honest node would mine in the time it takes an adversary to mine a single block on its own, that is not exactly the same as saying that the adversary would receive 1 over R of the block rewards if they were to mine honestly, because again, there's this problem where the adversary is much more capable of spending a long time to create 1 block than it is to spend a short amount of time to create the same number of blocks, right? If the adversary is limited to making a block every 10 minutes or so, then it's really hard for the adversary to work, and they basically have this quadratic penalty. So if you wanted to describe it in terms of the fraction of rewards, it would be 1 over the fraction of the rewards that they receive. Some bonus slides to talk about sort of other things. This is an interesting thing that it sort of surprised me that it's not too easy to find an explanation of this. One question is, okay, we have this phrase, the longest chain rule, and it sort of implies that the number of blocks in the chain is the only thing that's important. And the question is, why can't that just simply be the rule, right? Why is it that Bitcoin uses the total cumulative proof of work rather than just the absolute number of blocks in the chain? And the point is that then you might be vulnerable to a sort of classical version of the timestamp attack where you decreased the difficulty instead of increased it, right? So one thing you can imagine is if in real life the difficulty goes up 10 times and then stays steady, what an attacker could do is just keep keep things steady for a long time and mine at 1/10 the difficulty of the rest of the network, and then shoot it up to 10 times at the end, and both chains would have the same number of blocks, and both chains would have this the same timestamp, but the attack chain would take much less work to produce, and so it's feasible that an attacker could produce it first. So it's definitely like important on some level to be tracking the work of the chain rather than just the number of blocks in the chain. Another sort of interesting sort of collection of prior works is like, does this like cause problems even if everybody is basically behaving honestly, right? Like these quantum computers, they seem so cool. Like maybe they'll just like cause problems. Maybe they'll just get so good that it doesn't even matter that they might be attacking. Like they'll just be like producing blocks so fast on an honest basis that things will be a problem. And there's this 10 minutes problem that I've sort of highlighted. And then there's the sort of clock speed of the quantum computers. But then there's I think the reason that this is not so much of an actual concern is that like even though it's a quadratic speed up Grover's algorithm, it's not like an exponential speed up. So it would basically be the same maybe as having like, you know, it would be like the next step after an ASIC would be like the quantum ASICs, and maybe that's how it will eventually evolve. There's some like caveat to this like that. Even if you just like assume that all these like Grover quantum computer miners are sort of working, there's still sort of these weird incentive issues where it's like because you've already done like a certain amount of work on your own block, like when a new block gets published, you're sort of more incentivized to do sort of selfish mining type attacks, because if you're doing selfish mining, then you know it's like you're very incentivized to keep working on your own block because your own block, you've already done a lot of work on it. And each next hash that you do on the work that you've already done is like really valuable to you, right? Because it's sort of like quadratically increasing. Yeah, like mitigation brainstorming. Okay, so this is, right? So there's like a lot of potential ways to mitigate this that you could think of. So one observation is that the hash function, right? Like making the hash function harder is just already taking things back more into the classical regime. So if the hash function is harder, then the Grover algorithm is going to be able to do less hashes, and then it's going to be less quadratic advantage. So I think what Bitcoin, the hash function is, you apply SHA-256 twice on the block header. And so a different thing you could do is just apply SHA-256 like 1,000 times. Of course, that would like come with its own penalty and like the time it takes to verify a block. You could also, this is something, this top one is something that Pratyush Tiwari pointed out to me, which is that even though Grover's algorithm can be applied in principle to any problem, that doesn't necessarily mean it has a quadratic speed up over classical computers on every problem. Not because Grover's algorithm doesn't work, but because there are some problems where there is like a structure to them that the classical miners can actually just have that same speed up. So an example of this would be like, this is sort of maybe a very like complicated contrived example, but if you have like some iterated hashing, basically if you like simulated the entire mining process within a ZKVM, then it doesn't seem possible for a quantum miner to necessarily speed that up, because
why? I'm not following it.
Because if you're doing everything inside a ZKVM, it's not enough for it's not that you just have to basically what you're producing here is not just a proof that your final hash was within the difficulty. It is a proof simultaneously that all of the hashes that you evaluated that came before the final hash were above the difficulty, and then your final hash was below the difficulty.
I mean, in Bitcoin, like proof of work kind of theory, there's this like progress-free notion that's kind of relevant here. I mean, it seems like you're saying that iterated things that are kind of inherently sequential are not amenable to this Grover attack. But that's exactly, making it kind of unsuitable for small miners to get proportional contribution, because then the problem with anything that's iterated is that whoever goes fastest always is, going faster, and, no one else gets a fair chance of going early. So like VDF, just doing like VDFs somehow, like whoever's the first to compute a long VDF wins. that'll always favor whoever computes the VDF slightly faster than everyone else always wins, rather than proportionally wins.
Right. So I guess the point is that like there would be like a lot of overhead for the proof at the end. Yeah, I see what you're saying. You're saying that like instead of just like what the quantum miner would do here would be like it would run in parallel a bunch of things that separately do a single hash and then try to like hope that that hash is enough and then do the recursive snark on that hash. But then they have to do a lot of overhead for like computing the snarks themselves. Yeah, so that's like maybe a good counterexample. So maybe that's not necessarily a good mitigation. That's a good point. There are other potential mitigations though. One is like longest chain versus chain work. There are different reasons to do both of them, but maybe there's some like hybrid of them that would work. And it doesn't seem to me that that would necessarily like completely eliminate the attack, but maybe it would make the attack like r to the 4 instead of r to the 2 or something like that. And then there's just checkpointing, right? So I think I mentioned there was like 32 weeks to like accomplish the attack, even if you have like a quarter of the hash power or whatever. And so if you just checkpoint the chain every 31 weeks, then things would be fine. But then again, like some people think that you shouldn't do any checkpoints for Bitcoin because that makes it like not objective what the true longest chain is. You could also there's also this other consideration of the difficulty adjustment parameter, right? So if you take it down from 4 to like 1.01, right? If you like much more strongly limit what you can do for the difficulty adjustment, that would make it harder because you would have to spend much more time like in the ramp up phase to the ramp up to the high difficulty. And that seems like a big sort of downside for the quantum miner. But then again, I think that there is like quite a lot of natural variance in the like hash power on Bitcoin, and the difficulty adjustment will like regularly go up or down by like several percent. And so it's not necessarily like possible to like be too hard about how like quickly you're changing the difficulty. So I don't know if like any of these mitigations necessarily work that well. But yeah, I don't know if there's like any like final questions from people on the YouTube or the Zoom call.
Don't see any.
How many YouTube streamers are there?
Looks like there are 4 concurrent viewers on YouTube.
I'm one of them.
Yes, and Andrew is one of them. So there are 3 concurrent viewers that are. Oh, we have a question from.
Please go
YouTube
ahead with
user,
your question.
Uri Air.
Waiting patiently for a question to be typed.
Yeah.
Cool.
Question regarding the practicality of the attack. Okay, cool. What is your question regarding practicality?
Do you have a favorite quantum computing vendor?
Quantum computing
Yeah.
vendor. The only
If I had $10 million to spend on a quantum miner, where would I go to get one?
Right. So the only there is one like Swiss company that uses quantum. They basically do quantum key distribution. So this is like
Okay.
the first we're actually using quantum cryptography for practical things. But it's not that. Yeah. So I guess this is something that I haven't really emphasized too much, but this definitely requires what is known as a fully fault-tolerant quantum computer. So this is it requires the same kind of quantum computer that would be capable of carrying out Shor's algorithm, the sort of quantum computer that we expect is at least a decade away.
I see.
If not longer.
You need coherence of the multi-qubits, and
yes,
for it to
you
be
need
long-lived
multiple.
enough.
Yes,
I mean, this would need to be long-lived for kind of the whole.
And it would have to be possible to maintain the qubits in coherence. Perhaps using some kind of error correction for, however many years or centuries it took to to carry out the attack.
Wow.
Right. So if you only have 1% of the hash power, right, then it takes, like 1 over 100, right? So 100 squared is 10,000 times 2 weeks. So 20,000 weeks to accomplish the attack with that little hash power, which is like, okay, now you're getting into the sort of like ridiculous levels of like, is this a feasible attack?
Mm-hmm.
I guess like all you can really say at that point is like, okay, but we have at the very least we have proven that it is not secure in the traditional sense of like it would require an exponential in the security parameter amount of time to attack.
Oh, there we go.
In the paper, okay. In the paper, you said the attack on Bitcoin takes around 800 years, which is not exactly realistic. Yes. My understanding is this is due to the high hash rate and the long long difficulty adjustment window. Yes. The time calculated against a lower, right? Yes, but a similar coin, for example, Dogecoin or Litecoin. Yeah, so that's a good question. We haven't looked into like specific other. So Dogecoin and Litecoin, those I think are both examples of Nakamoto consensus chains that are basically the same in terms of their consensus algorithm, the same as Bitcoin, but with these different parameters. So I don't know what the difficulty adjustment like epochs look like on those chains. And I think Litecoin, it uses a different hash function, right? It uses scrypt.
Yeah.
So the things that you would need to do to figure out how long it would take for one of those is like, okay, if in Bitcoin it's 2 weeks, but if Dogecoin is doing something crazy like, every like 10 hours it's doing a difficulty adjustment, then it would be you would divide by that number, and then you would have to multiply by however many. Right. Basically, I guess the point is that it still comes down to this value R, which is basically the fraction of the speed at which the attacker can produce the chain relative to the honest chain. But the point is that if it's a different, potentially more complicated hash function, like in practice, that might mean that your R value is worse, because if it's a more complicated hash function, the Grover's algorithm is not going to have as much, in particular, if it's a deeper hash function, if it's a deeper in terms of circuit depth. I think we retrieved our the circuit depth of SHA-256 from this sort of Bristol, this website on that gives the values for a few cryptographic operations. So if you wanted to look into what is the depth of the circuit that would be required to implement scrypt, that would potentially mean that it would take a quantum computer much longer to do a single Grover iteration on scrypt, and therefore that it would take longer to mine.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, is scrypt one of these I've heard of memory hard hash functions?
Yeah, but it's got really low parameters for that or something, so it's read-only memory.
Right. I mean that strikes me as something potentially similar to this structure thing. If you're if it's something where you're producing a lot of hashes, but you have to produce all of them, and it's sort of harder to make a bunch. I don't know exactly what the consequences would be.
Yeah, I mean, there's other ones too. There was the NDSS paper on the, I suddenly forget what it's called, but the one that Zcash uses now by Dmitry and
Right.
Beryakov.
Yeah, I don't know the name of this hash function, but
Okay. It does some other searching problem, a Wagner birthday paradox searching kind of thing.
Yes.
It
birthday
inherently
paradox
requires long.
It's
like a long thing to try one iteration, but then easy to check once you found it. So it's
Right.
a hybrid of progress-free and longer effort.
Right. So that's an interesting point. I think for specifically the birthday paradox, how long does it take a quantum computer to find a hash collision? I think it's it's a different than, it's similar to Grover search. It's something different, and the factor, the exponent is 1.5 instead of 2.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something where you that is the improvement that like a quantum computer can provide you for like finding hash collisions, basically.
That's great.
Yes, Uriel says, thank you. Indeed, expect the attack is more realistic on any coin other than Bitcoin. Yeah, certainly. I mean, probably the biggest factor in considering whether it's realistic is, is this some coin that has like a very low, just like classical hash power? Like I think Bitcoin probably has the most, people producing ASICs for it to make the like hash power really high. And maybe the point is just that like, there's some chain where it's like its own custom hash function, and there's not many people mining on that chain, and so like that would be like a vulnerable chain to attack with this sort of thing.
All right, you did it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I will probably end the stream. All right. Take care. End the stream.
Good reading group. That was superb. Excellent presentation.